All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started. We have a few people who may be latecomers, but we're going to go ahead so we have the the full hour with our distinguished guests. So welcome to the first program of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia of 2020. And we are starting the new year with what is obviously a perennial topic, one that could be relevant, I think, in any year of our lifetimes. The causes and potential ways to address instability in the Middle East. In honor of the topic, we asked the building to set the temperature on Abu Dhabi summer. We want to acclimatize you, literally. So if anybody wants to take off a layer, that's fine as long as there's one under it. So we are delighted to have with us this evening editors and contributors to an important new book on this subject published by the American Enterprise Institute. Michael Rubin is a resident scholar at AEI, a former advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and a researcher on both Arab and Iranian issues. Brian Katulis is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a veteran of President Clinton's National Security Council, State Department, and Defense Department. In addition to both of these policy experts being experienced practitioners and students of American foreign policy in the Middle East and of events in the region itself, I'm also excited because our two guests bridge the traditionally separate Republican and Democratic camps in our foreign policy establishment, which gives us the opportunity here tonight and through their book to see these issues from different points of view on the American political spectrum, something that's becoming, as you all know, more rare to find. So we're going to ask Michael and Brian to each make about 5 minutes of opening remarks. Then the three of us will have a conversation, and of course, towards the end, we'll turn to questions from you. So please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is actually, I think, my third time at the Philadelphia World Affairs Council. Hopefully, the third time will be the charm. At any rate, the genesis of this project was just a recognition that while working in Washington, we can easily get caught up in the political timeline of whatever administration is in power. If we want to be honest, and if we take a step backward, by any metric, the United States has been an abject failure in achieving our goals in the Middle East over the last 50 years or so. I mean, for example, if our goal is Middle Eastern peace, or our goal is democratization, or our goal is human rights, or our goal is countering terrorism. The fact of the matter is that it's hard to suggest by any metric that the United States has achieved those goals. And so while we often will be subject to the spin of any administration and those who are trying to cement the legacy for their participation in those administrations, what we wanted to do is take a broader look and also take a look with a little bit of humility and recognize that the whole world doesn't revolve around Washington, D.C. Both of us have traveled a great deal in the Middle East in different capacities. I used to live in the Islamic Republic of Iran. They used to call me Pesari Shaitani Bozorg. I saw some Iranians here. I'm son of the great Satan. And I had spent some time, several years in Iraq as well, both before and after the war. Brian, of course, had worked in the Palestinian territories for the National Democratic Institute, and also in Egypt. And so we wanted to compare what we were hearing on the ground on some basic key issues. For example, when people in the region talk about the lack of stability or the failures they face, how is their conversation different than ours? And so, for example, in Morocco, we travel to Morocco together. We're actually speaking at Mohammed V University together. Whenever we travel, we try to go to universities because that's a good way. If you only meet with diplomats, of course, then you get the filter. Students haven't developed their filter, as we've come to understand through the years. But in Morocco, many officials talked about the education crisis. How do you get Morocco up to current world standards? But when we look at issues like disruptive technology, Well, disruptive technology, we're having debates about what that's going to mean to our economy. Is the Middle East somehow going to be immune from automation looking into the future? And are they prepared? A lot of countries think that they are immune, but that's just a sign that they're not prepared. Other issues, for example, when we look at the military, why is it that the militaries in the region tend to do more to undercut stability than to add stability? Or if you want to look at military's declared purposes, why is it that Arab militaries always lose wars? And is it because they simply can't acknowledge in many ways the mistakes because of honor and shame and culture and so forth? And we would try to put aside the political correctness that is oftentimes a third rail in conversations about these issues, because multiculturalism isn't just walking into a sushi restaurant and being able to order a mojito. Fundamentally, it's recognizing that different peoples can think in different ways, and we need to recognize that. Iran is a culture that goes back 2,000 years. They have not only their own political and diplomatic history, but their own intellectual history as well, which helps shapes how they see things. With regard to I wrote the chapter on legitimacy. Brian wrote the chapter on governance. With regard to the chapter on legitimacy, if the United States is trying to spend aid money, billions of dollars per year, in order to provide better governance, in order to bolster legitimacy, has anyone ever actually stepped back and asked whether people in the region consider legitimacy to mean the same thing that we do? I know many Americans would assume that it's a compact between citizenry and the government, and that you have the government should provide services and so forth. But when I'm in Iraq, for example, most people are much more willing to ascribe legitimacy to any government that puts a Shiite flag or a Kurdish nationalist flag over a building rather than actually provide something. Now, this is changing because what a lot of people don't realize is 40% of Iraqis have been born after the 2003 war, and they're not willing to accept the same excuses they used to. And so how does this generational change move things? Now, I'll just end with a little bit of humility before handing this over to Brian, because admittedly I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past, and my friends on the left would say I probably only get that right about 50% of the time. But what we were trying to do was just a broad grasp, looking not within the American political calendar, not looking with Obama derangement syndrome or Trump derangement syndrome, but rather do a fresh look at why it is that we are consistently failing in any of our efforts, whether it's left, right, or center, when it comes to the region, and what this means for U.S. policy going forward. That part we'll talk about more in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you all for coming tonight. It really is a pleasure to engage with you. And I really want to get to the Q&A because we live in this bubble called Washington, D.C., and it's so unreal. I can tell you stories just from my day earlier today about how disconnected conversations are, not only from the rest of the country, but from the world when you're talking Iran and foreign policy. And it's just refreshing to get out. Michael just spent the last 5 minutes dodging the answer to the question, what really causes instability in the Middle East? And he's dodged it. I have a simple answer. What really causes instability in the Middle East? It's Michael Rubin and neocons who are warmongering. It's a joke, of course. But it's not to dismiss that. Sort of. Sort of. We can get into that later.
We're adjourned.
Mic drop. But that was the nature of the debate you're about to, or you have experienced, and you'll experience in the next 10 months, 11 months. It feels like 10 years in this country. What we wanted to do. One note on what we wanted to do with the book and the project, because Michael incidentally mentioned that we traveled to Morocco and a few countries. We went to every single country you could reasonably go to and keep your head on your torso and stay safe. We both have young kids, and in this whole process, we wanted to get out. But we also brought people in Washington who don't sit down with each other and tried to talk. And the point there was not to get some sort of soft, mushy consensus. It was just to have a dialogue. If you've heard of this thing called Twitter, social media, all the kids are on it, I think. You see the fights that people have that sort of spiral off into a very sort of negative space. And what we wanted to do was move beyond. I often think of this, and your piece recently in the Philadelphia Inquirer, hopefully we can talk about that as well, is to move beyond this era of what I call troll power. We live in an era of troll power where people know more what they're against as opposed to what they're for. And certainly, Michael and I have had some serious disagreements on the Iran nuclear deal, on the Iraq War. I think when we first met, you were working in the Bush administration, and I was completely against it. But we're not. A think tank is not going to solve all of these problems. But we were trying to sort of, in our little microcosm, model sort of the sorts of actions and behaviors, and start commenting on policy by doing analysis. So that was, and do it with sort of odd bedfellows, people that we're not comfortable with. So that was one of the main points. Just 3 points on the substance of the book, and sort of try to set the table for a broad conversation on the Middle East. I'm sure we're going to get into the day-to-days and things like that. But that first point I wanted to stress. Tonight I'm actually going to the Middle East to get away from the tribalism and sectarianism of America. I'm getting on a plane from Newark at 11. Look, the book, as Michael briefly mentioned, tries to delve into a lot of the issues that are quite familiar with a lot of people who, if you've been following the region. About 17 years ago, the Arab UN Human Development Reports tracked a lot of the problems that are coming from within. And I'll talk about my chapter on governance. There's also, I think, great chapters on political ideology, on the economic models that countries are using. So it's sort of getting out of the bubble and trying to understand that. And the first main point that I think is overarching across these chapters is that the Middle East has these crushing demographic, economic, and social pressures that are coming from within. If you thought that the 2011 Arab uprisings were over, you're dead wrong. And you just look at what's happening nearly every day over the past year, from Algeria to the Sudan, and again, we can get into the definition of how you define the Middle East, to Iran today, to Iraq before this recent incident. And a lot of these protests are driven by a new generation who simply has had enough. They've had enough of the old model, and it truly is not over in places like Egypt, in my belief, despite sort of the backlash of authoritarians. That's the top line, and our book sort of gets into it issue by issue with some great experts. A second thing which our book doesn't really do, but I think is a driver of instability, is the battle for power and influence among the countries of the region. And this is a multifaceted, multidimensional sort of fight. Sometimes people classify it as Sunni versus Shia and Iran versus Saudi Arabia. That has dimensions of it, but that's a little thin. We have to remember that this is about power, and it's about governments trying to maintain their own positions in power and then project influence. I say that it's multidimensional. What do I mean by that? It's not just like the Cold War, where people were using militaries and nuclear weapons to throw their weight around. In today's Middle East, there's so many different dimensions, like politics, the media and the media fights that go on between different countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, Iran, Saudi Arabia definitely. You go to a place like Iraq, a lot of those tensions that we experience here at home, which I think are quite tribal and sectarian, are on full display in that. So there's this battle that, again, we're affected by it. We're there because we're, I think, still the most influential outside power, though that influence, I think, is much diminished over the last 15 and 20 years. But that's sort of a big centerpiece of the struggle. And the third thing I'd say, and to close out, a bit on the chapter I wrote on governance and why. Michael mentioned that I started my career working in Palestine and Jordan and in Egypt, and this was back in the 1990s. During the Clinton administration, the first term, and I was working with a non-governmental organization. First real experience in my 20s working with a group that was trying to help the Palestinians who had just set up their own interim governing authority, according to the Oslo process and things like this. And to me, what has transpired there, and there are layers of complexity, which we can get into tonight, about the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the lack of resolution there, which I think is still at its core. But a big part of, I think, the challenge that still exists today is the lack of a responsive governance and a government system. And there's a lot of constraints in Palestine. We were trying from the outside to help a new parliament for the Palestinians, have the tools to actually have an open debate and to establish ministries that delivered services. And I wanted to write about that in part because of those earlier experiences, because I felt like America didn't really appreciate or knew very well how to do that. And Michael certainly probably experienced that when he worked in Iraq in those early years, where people in these countries desire what we all, I think, benefit from and also aspire to see better things from in our own government, local and things like this. And if you get into it, I mean, I go through monarchies, republics, and then those fragmented, fractured states like Syria, Yemen, Libya. And there's many different models. And I'll close on this, and I want to close in this way because I know you were recently in Saudi Arabia. There are interesting experiments that are happening in monarchies, including in the controversial sort of Saudi Arabia led by MBS. And I hope I paint an accurate view there where what is going on inside the country, I think, is historic, but I don't put a lot of hope in it succeeding at this moment because it still remains an absolute monarchy. What they're trying to do is open things up on the social front, a little bit on the economic front, and again, it's only a little bit to change this economic model that has driven this country basically to a dependency from within. And they're trying to change it, but I think they're still nibbling on the edges and not likely to succeed for one main reason, is the absence of basic freedoms that we enjoy here, that there's a new generation of Saudis. I talked about this generational transition, many of whom, millions of whom, have been educated in America, in Europe, in Canada, and other places. And now they're coming back. And I think this new young leadership is brash, it's reckless, it's ordered murders of dissidents and journalists, it started a war in Yemen. But it's also not managing its internal situation very well. It's trying to get ahead of this new generation that's pushing them. We often talk about Saudi Arabia of being beholden to the clerics, and that's changing. But I don't know that the leadership is moving fast enough to deal with sort of the new sentiment among the next generation of Saudis. They're trying to use it, the tools of governance, and adapt it to reflect the demands for something new. But I'm not certain that they'll succeed. And to close off, again, and I hope we talk about U.S. policy, this book doesn't do that much, in part because we wanted to understand the nature of sort of the countries in this broader region from within, so that we can formulate better policies, and in my view, and this is where we might disagree, policies that aren't so military-centric, that aren't focused simply on the question of how many troops are staying in which corner of Syria or Iraq, but take a bigger picture at the drivers of instability, which largely come from within. And I hope that gives a bigger context for the discussion we'll have tonight.
Thank you both. So I want to delve into the substance of the book. I want to hold off for at least a couple of minutes on the U.S. policy questions, right, and talk about the internal sources of instability. So let's start with kind of some of the big overarching concepts that you deal with in the book. There is a view that a lot of people hold and a lot of people say almost reflexively that the main problem in the region is the way the European colonialists drew the maps. That you have borders that do not reflect the self-determination of peoples because you've got peoples, coherent peoples across those border lines and sectarianism therefore in the states. And these are all questions that could take our full amount of time, so I'm going to ask for sort of pithy answers, but how do you respond to that? Do you think that is in fact a main driver of instability?
I would actually argue no. And we often had this debate come up in the wake of the 100th anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now, when you look at a map of the Middle East, wherever you see a straight line, that's an artificial border. But just because you have an artificial border doesn't mean that the country itself is arbitrary. Because historically, most people lived along river in the Middle East. With the exception of Iran, most people lived along rivers or along the coast. So if you look at Egypt, for example, it doesn't actually matter where you draw the border because 90% of the population is along the Nile River anyway. And there's always been a concept of Egyptness. Likewise, Iraq may only have become independent in 1932. And people can say it's an artificial construct, but going back in Arabic literature to the 13th century, you have the concept of Iraq being talked about. In many ways, the concept of Iraq is sort of like the concept of Palestine or Kurdistan today, in which no one denies that this sort of thing exists, even if it doesn't have finite agreed upon borders. And the same thing is true with any numbers of other countries. Many of the countries have also created a legitimacy or sort of sought to grasp a legitimacy by retroactively extending their identity backwards. So Yemen has the Queen of Sheba, the Lebanese have the Phoenicians, the Palestinians have the Canaanites, the Kurds have the Medeans, Bahrain has the lost culture of Dilmun. The only truly artificial countries I can think about in the region would be Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Kuwait. And of course, you've had other, perhaps Saudi Arabia to some extent, and we can talk about regionalism, or at least parts of Saudi Arabia. The point of this, however, is number one, you do have historical antecedents, which are fairly natural and logical. Number two, if you look at the actual map of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that's not what resulted in the Middle East. It doesn't really look much like anything else. Number three, you have, even when you do have artificial states, over the past 100 years, a nationalism has been created in those states where there is a sense of Jordanian identity, there is a sense of Emirati identity, there is a sense of Kuwaiti identity, and someday there might be a sense of Qatari identity, if only in objection to or in contrast to other things. And therefore, I do see it as a little bit overwrought, a little bit falling into the American tendency to A, navel gaze, and also to, and this is counterproductive, to forget the agency that people in the regions have with regard to their own problems. And one of the things which should be apparent for those of you who have traveled, and I know the Philadelphia World Affairs Council does great trips to the region, in the past to Iran, most recently to the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia and so forth, is that oftentimes the debates in these countries now are a little bit more honest than the debates which we have in the United States about these countries, if only because the concept of the political correctness or oversensitivity hasn't percolated into their debates the way sometimes it has with us.
Just really quickly, that's my buddy Michael's being pithy right there, which is great. No. Only one note on your last point, which is spot on. The rise of nationalism, especially I would say the last 2 or 3 years, has been an interesting story where there's been a rally around the flag approach in many of these countries, in part because of the shock of Daesh, of ISIS, which came with a new conception. And some of this nationalism, I think, was organic and at the popular level. And it's been there in places like Egypt. I lived in Egypt, and it's quite strong if you've been there. But there's also been campaigns in some of these, what Michael calls artificial countries, which I think are very real and seeped into sort of the mindset and the very individual identities of Jordanians, of Emiratis, and others. And you go, if you've been to these countries or live there, turn on the TV, they'll be incredibly sort of jingoistic, sort of nationalistic, but television programs on there, and trying to, again, create an identity. So the issue is an important one, and this is me being pithy. There's a really good book, A Peace to End All Peace, by David Frumkin, if you get into sort of that history. But I completely agree with Michael's point, is that it's simply about not artificial borders. Now the storyline has moved on 100 years later.
Thank you. So a second sort of version of this, high altitude explanation for instability is that there's been no reformation in Islam. The Enlightenment value of the separation of church and state has not moved into the region. And so the problem is that you have a sort of anti-modern, politicized Islam. Your response?
I think that's an element of it, and he can. I'll be quick here, and then you can. We'll keep it short. Yeah, but he'll be less quick. But when we talk about Islam today, it's not a monolith. It's sort of very decentralized, and there are many different strands. And that multi-dimensional fight for power and influence in the region, a key component of it is over the very definition of Islam. Political Islamists versus others like Saudi Arabia or UAE have different conceptions of it. And it's very much at the core of the struggle. It was in a place like Egypt, which I track very closely during that confusing period from 2011 when there was the uprising against Mubarak, to 2013, where there was a coup and the fight. So it's definitely there. But the main point I'd stress, and it's often I think not understood, is that it's such a diverse and pluralistic religion, and the interpretation of it is up for grabs. And it's particularly up for grabs, I think, among Muslims in America and Europe. People are questioning it and changing it. Just like I was raised in the Catholic faith and practicing Christian now. It's that tug and pull of modernity. And the key question, and Michael may get into this, is then how do the governments of the region that sort of rest their legitimacy on religion, how are they dealing with that? Saudi Arabia is now trying to impose a different model from above and bring religious scholars here to talk to all of us and talk about how they're changing things. Turkey has a different approach. But the main point is that it's not one size fits all, and it's very much about the power struggle, Islam, and the different interpretations.
Let me look at this just very briefly in a slightly different way. If any of you went back home and you Googled Egypt in the 1940s, or Iran in the 1930s, or Afghanistan in the 1960s, and do a Google image search, you're going to get a very different view of what these societies were like, but that doesn't mean that they were any less Islamic at that point in time. A lot of what we see now is the aftermath of the Saudi Arabia and the petrodollar. And I think Saudi Arabia had a change of heart in many ways, especially after 2004. Not 2001, 2004, when they had the blowback of their own compound bombings in Riyadh and so forth. Frankly, I think Turkey is the new Saudi Arabia when it comes to be an engine for radicalism worldwide. That said, two issues where I think the United States could do more. Number one, what's very interesting to look at across the region are the elements of reform, and these debates are vibrant. So, for example, it's not just a matter of Sunnis and Shiites and so forth, but debates about whether the Quran should be interpreted. If God is all-knowing and the Quran has always existed, 1,000,000 years in the past, even though it was only revealed to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century, then how much, and if God's all-knowing, how much of the Quran was designed in a way or phrased in a way to be received by 7th century Arabian culture, as opposed to simply being interpreted? And so you have people like Abdul Karim Soroush in Iran and Mohammad Shahrour and others who have said, we shouldn't be more Arab than the Arabs, we shouldn't be more Arabian than the Arabians, and we need to sort of reinterpret this. There's been other trends of reformation. If you want to look at the heart of extremism, I would argue that it goes theologically to the concept of abrogation. Abrogation in short, is this notion that if you have two verses of the Quran which are contradictory, you automatically go to the one which was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad last. The problem with this is the layman's definition of prophet is someone who talks to God and then proceeds to piss off everyone else around them. Because when you think about the life story of any prophet, it's about changing conventional wisdom on earth. The first verses revealed to the Prophet Muhammad were much more tolerant, and they were about living with others. The last ones were statescraft and much more extreme. We've seen in Sudan, for example, this idea, should we have reverse abrogation, where you take the early verses and have them abrogate the later verses? The last point, quickly, is we tend to be very Saudi-centric, and this as a country, and this has certainly been the case since Franklin Delano Roosevelt came back and met with Ibn Saud on board the USS Quincy on February 14th, 1945. By the way, his translator was a Marine colonel who introduced basketball to the Middle East. So that meeting was consequential for two reasons. At any rate, Saudi Arabia, because of oil, is something that got our attention. But when we were in Morocco, Morocco has a fascinating program called the Moshadat program, in which when you are educating an imam, you're actually educating them alongside an equal number of women in the same program and the same curriculum, including Western sciences and so forth. It's a lot harder to be a misogynist when you're in a class filled with women. At any rate, and Morocco has spread this throughout Western Africa, Mali, Mauritania, Cote d'Ivoire, and so forth, and working with the Egyptians as well. The question is, when people bring up Morocco back in Washington, oh, Morocco, it's just peripheral. But theologically and historically, It's much more important than Saudi Arabia ever was. And so through our own ignorance of the long breadth of history, do we end up undercutting some of the policy options for helping to promote the Reformation which you were talking about?
So the book tries to unpack the question of what constitutes legitimacy. And you and your fellow authors go through a number of different definitions. To bring it to the American policy context, or sort of start that discussion, I guess I have sort of a simple question about that. Should the United States ever have a definition of legitimacy that is anything other than the consent of the governed? First part. Second part is kind of puts right immediately the test of that first part, which is, to the extent that we've seen the fair elections, democratic elections occur, in which you can argue the consent of the governed was being registered, we often really didn't like the outcomes, right? So we got Hamas, we got a Shia-led government and a pro-Iranian government in Iraq. So what are we for? Is it elections, or is it only elections that result in governments that we believe respect individual human rights?
Great questions. I would say, first of all, my own personal opinion. And by the way, we did not ask people to come to, as Brian said, to consensus in this book. We chose chapter authors. We all agreed on the problems, but we chose chapter authors who had strong opinions. And so we don't necessarily all agree with everything. That said, we edited the book pretty stringently so that it reads as a coherent whole, unlike most edited collections. Now, to answer your question, legitimacy absolutely has to do with consent of the governed, in my view, not necessarily the view of those in the Middle East. That doesn't mean that every legitimate government needs to be someone who is deserving of U.S. support. So that's a different question right there. I would say rule of thumb in the Middle East is I wouldn't want to support any elections or the outcome of any elections in which political parties maintain militias. Because if you maintain militias, then basically what you're saying is, we want the legitimacy of the ballot box, but if we can't get that, we're going to get the legitimacy of the point of the gun. And to me, that's fundamentally dishonest. And so let me hand it off to Brian, and then I'll disagree with what he says and continue the conversation.
No, I mean, look, it's a really deep and important question, and I think as a matter of U.S. policy, Egypt is an excellent case study in this, because what happened in Egypt in 2011 was there was a popular uprising, and in essence, the Egyptian security establishment made the decision to remove Mubarak from power. I think the Obama administration made some mistakes in being so publicly out there and actually sending mixed signals by sending Ambassador Frank Wisner to talk to Mubarak, and he was saying one thing and then publicly saying another. And I think it was kind of a mistake to do that when, in essence, the decision was made by the SCAF, the military command, to get rid of Mubarak. And then they implemented an election process for the first time in Egypt's history. They had a competitive election, and first for the parliament, and then second for president. And Islamists won. The Muslim Brotherhood won. Now, the story is very complicated because a lot of Egyptians, and I draw this parallel, some people don't like it, and I don't mean any disrespect to anybody's political views, but many Egyptians, when they saw Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood, elected president of Egypt, they felt like many today feel like about Donald Trump. They were shocked and horrified that someone like this was representing their country, and it was the same sort of divide. You add to it, this question of legitimacy wasn't just internal to Egypt. You had neighboring countries with their petrodollars, particularly the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and others, who you could read David Kirkpatrick's book, which catches a glimmer of this, threw their weight into this fight over legitimacy inside of Egypt and essentially backed what became a military coup in 2013. So I'm introducing this specific case because it was a test case for, and I know you're having Samantha here, I think, Samantha Power, I saw her yesterday at our conference. And she talks a little bit about this. You should come. And it's a great book, and it's really interesting, but not as much as Syria and other things. There was real fights inside the Obama administration, which I didn't serve in, but talked frequently. And pretty early on, you can ask her about this if you come to her event. I think she was involved in these discussions. President Obama basically decided not to abide by our own law. Our own law said that when there's a military coup, which by any definition of what happened in July of 2013, that's what it is. We essentially suspended a military exercise, held back delivery. You know this, you worked on the Hill. Held back delivery of some of the assistance in the hopes that it would be used as carrots and sticks to move Egypt back to some sort of democratic path. But then other things overtook U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. The Iran nuclear deal. Kerry was, Energizer Bunny on the Middle East peace process. So navigating all of these things, essentially the question of what is legitimacy inside of Egypt got pushed down maybe to like the 15th issue. And we reinstated the aid that was held back without getting any improvement in Egypt's democratic or human rights performance. And you see this with tragic consequences, in my view. You see an Egyptian-American citizen died yesterday in prison. And he's one of a dozen, at least, American citizens who have been, I think, imprisoned under very questionable terms. And we basically don't use that leverage in any meaningful way.
One question that came up after this book, and it's just one of those things to think about. Oftentimes the United States wants to give aid, and Brian had mentioned the suspension of aid and so forth, wants to give aid to sort of provide better government services. We're generous people, whether it's through government or whether it's in private. But one of the fundamental questions that needs to be asked is whether that generosity and that provision of aid, the way it's given, can actually erode legitimacy and governance in the region. After all, if you can pick your problem set, whether it's the Palestinians, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Syria, whether it's whatever, if you are giving money to build houses, schools, water, whether it's through the United States or the United Nations, then what's the job of a government? And if you're providing that sort of aid as a development safety net, given the fungibility of money, does that simply actually add fuel to the fire of instability elsewhere? If you're giving aid to build schools and so forth, then the legitimacy of government doesn't come from that, and instead shifts to waging the sectarian or political warfare. And in the long term, what does this mean for the sort of strategy of the United States moving forward?
I want to go into a couple of a little bit more granular things from chapters in the book. In Danielle Pletka's overview, and by the way, great respect for her, used to work with her on the Hill. She writes, this is a quote, "The Arab world cannot be reformed without reforming education, and education cannot be reformed without reforming the Arab world." So I read that and I said, right. But it's not a lot of practical guidance, right? In terms of the role of education and what we would like to see. In the time that I've spent in the region, talked to lots and lots of college students and recent college graduates, and they are all really grateful for their free educations, which often go on for many, many years and result in many, many degrees. But they're also deeply resentful that those educations are not tied to any kind of economic opportunity, that they're just, the jobs aren't there, and those educated in secular subjects, in a way, have no place to go. So I guess what I'm asking is the problem a lack of education? Is the problem the wrong kind of education? Is the problem, to a certain extent, over-education? That doesn't fit economic realities?
I think it's the lack of the appropriate education that fits with the modern world. I'll tell an anecdote here because we can get into like blah 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 analysis. I was in Saudi Arabia and met with the education ministry recently, and I go there for research trips and try to get out of the bubble, not just talking to officials, but 2 or 3 years ago, when you go and meet with a minister, in Saudi Arabia, you would meet with the minister. He was a guy, and he would give you the talking points, and maybe there'd be an advisor as a note taker. This meeting, recent meeting, had like 15 people, and it was raucous. It was women, men. There was a lot of, it was like an open debate. And it was an interesting, again, you heard my skepticism about how I think the Vision 2030 and that model, because it's still an absolute monarchy and is not opening to freedoms, won't likely to succeed in its current form. But these were professionals who were wrestling with this key question of how do you actually upgrade the type of education, and that would be that is appropriate to the type of economy that you want to land the country on by 2030. And it's sort of a moving target. And for me, it was a very interesting study of the case for, and you know, it's hard to even write about this today because of how polarized the debate about Saudi Arabia is. But these sort of mid-level education ministry officials were fighting their own fight for progress. When you think about it, they were saying, look, our government has allowed Janet Jackson and all of these performers to come here, and we have these open concerts, but our textbooks actually say something about gender roles that aren't in line with this new policy of like social opening. So there's this, as we have in our own society, this tug and pull internal of how do we actually change that in a way that doesn't piss off so many of the ultra conservative families in different circles. Every country, no matter how autocratic, and Saudi Arabia is the most, has this sort of internal politics and management. And on education policy, that's, I think, but my answer is that they are trying to update an economic model that is not as heavily dependent on the petro industry. And I don't know that that's going to succeed. And they're also trying to update their education model at a time when, even in this country, we're going to have a problem with how do we define the nature of work? What will my 9-year-old son, Ben, actually be trained to do? So what kind of job, how do you define that? And but the fact that these societies, some of them, are struggling with it, I think is a good sign. Go ahead, John.
Well, Iran created the Islamazad university system shortly after the revolution in 1979, not to educate the masses like they said, but to take 18 to 22-year-olds off the streets and give them some place to sit where they could pretend to be productive. It's important to recognize that there's a certain cynicism in the way governments in the region sometimes handle education. That said, the Iraqi president, who may be known to several of you, Barham Saleh, was the founder of the American University of Iraq in Soleimani. And it's been a very successful experiment in bringing Iraqis from all over Iraq up to Soleimani and Iraqi Kurdistan, having an American-style education, and so forth. What I've been shocked by, and I've had conversations with Barham about, is all these other upstart American universities which have sought to cash in on the brand. And I had no clue before I started this that there is no regulation of the term American University or American College, that anyone can create one, and oftentimes they're the most dictatorial and embarrassing sort of institutions there are. That said, if the United States would be a little bit more proactive, when I was doing my dissertation years ago on Iranian history, I noticed that there were a lot of dissertations from Iranians who had gone to France and Germany and Britain in the 1920s and 30s, and they became the Anglophile or the fascist or the Francophile sort of Iranians of the next generation. So this goes into American questions about, for example, the visa ban. One other question, just answering that one issue about sort of education and the economy in the future. One of the more interesting debates, and I see this happening in Iraq, which is the country I focus most on, is about how do we tackle this by creating a private pension scheme. Because most people want, in rentier states, they want the government job because it's lifelong security. And you have, it's worse than Parkinson's law with the expansion of bureaucracy. But a lot of young people want to go out, they want to be entrepreneurial, but they don't necessarily want to take a risk. Another aspect of this is we went to the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority directly, and when you have the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, they're starting to, on one hand, they can't find a lot of people coming from local schools who can fulfill their needs, but they're willing to take people who show promise and educate them abroad and then bring them back. This brings up a longer question about development. in that we often talk about the benefits of small enterprises and family businesses. But I would argue that if you want to provide advancement, what we should actually be doing is trying to bring in big multinationals. Because when you have a small and medium-sized enterprise that may be capped at 50 people, where do you actually have the ability for promotion if you're not in that family? Whereas if you bring in an IBM, for example, theoretically into Cairo, and I don't mean the inshallah bukra mumkin aspect of IBM, tomorrow, God willing, maybe. At any rate, then you have people who can work their way up in the bureaucracy, and you have all the follow-on businesses which develop, the restaurants and so forth, which allow for the entrepreneurial spirit to take hold. I've seen this directly over the last year. I've made several trips to Somaliland, which is the breakaway region of Somalia. And when you had Dubai World come in and build the ports, most people were opposed to it because they thought their jobs would be taken away. But they retrained people, and now you have paved roads, you have new hotels, you have new businesses springing up around this hub. So it shows the interplay, if you will, between education and economic opportunity.
Okay, going to be mindful of time. Brian, for one, has a train to catch to a plane, so we will have to end on time. Open for questions from the audience, and we'll start with this gentleman right in the middle.
This is about Iran and its feelings about the United States. If in 1953 another country had come here, got rid of Dwight Eisenhower, and installed their own dictator for the next 26 years here, how do you think we'd be feeling about that country?
Oh.
Because that's obviously what we did to Iran.
Okay. Well, number one, I would be angry perhaps at all the co-conspirators in this, and we need to be mindful that the co-conspirators to the American and the British were the Iranian clergy. This was documented well in the discussions at the time of the red versus the black. The red were the Tudeh, the left-leaning, almost communist party of Iran. The blacks were the turban wearers, and so forth. Number two, we have to recognize that Mohammad Mossadegh wasn't the constitutional leader of Iran. He, unlike several other prime ministers, refused to accept the dismissal, and therefore that's why most people at the time, including Kermit Roosevelt in his book and his memoir about this, referred to this as a counter coup. The other thing that's just curious as an Iranian historian is most people forget that 8 years before the 1953 episode, you had the United States occupy part of Iran. And we never hear about that. The British, we hear about the Russian part of this with regard to the Azerbaijan crisis of 1946. The point of this is perception. I'll agree with you, perception means more than reality. If I have to trace the root of anti-Americanism in Iran, it's not the 1953 coup or counter coup. It's rather the great diplomatic immunity that all American citizens, including those working for Bell Helicopters, including those working for other businesses, enjoyed in the 50s and 60s. And most Iranians who were living through the time will tell stories about how a relative was killed by a drunk driver who couldn't be prosecuted because of the immunity they had. And we see this then playing in today into some of the debates in Iraq that occurred during the early Obama administration, late Bush administration with Prime Minister Maliki and so forth, and the whole question of immunity for Americans who would be inside Iraq.
Michael warned you he was a historian. That was great.
Budsy, please.
How would you have them deal with corruption?
A minute each.
I mean, look, I would start first with what we do. And Michael alluded to this in terms of our aid programs. And the best gym that I've ever been to in my life was in the West Bank town of Ramallah. And this was early on. And again, I think it's a travesty. I really do think it's an awful decision by the Trump administration to cut off the aid that they've done in the way that they did it, especially the aid that was going to hospitals and things like this. But there's been so much corruption. That's one small example of U.S. aid where we just don't know what we're doing and who we're funding. And in some cases, I think a lot of the military aid that we give to countries or arms sales as well feed this sort of corruption and this corrupt system. So don't help them with our own tax dollars in it. And you look at it. You just look at what has happened in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. We've had special inspector generals look at this, and we're talking literally billions of dollars, right? And we have, again, I appreciate a good line, and I love end endless war and all of this, and get ready for more of this. But where I would say, first stop doing harmful things with our own policies that engage that corruption and allow it to feed. Call it, pull back when I think there's corruption in places like Egypt's aid, which I think is on autopilot. What we give to the U.S. taxpayers give to Egypt, there's a lot of sort of froth and fluff that doesn't actually produce the security gains for Egypt, for a military that actually can't perform its job. We need to look under the hood. So I would start there. It sounds simple and modest. The reason why I think it's such an endemic problem in some of these countries, and it's hard to actually change it.
We've had interesting debates with regard to the difference between functional and dysfunctional corruption that have existed ever since the 2001 Afghanistan conflict and the 2003 Iraq conflict on up. What I would argue is we suffer the same thing in foreign aid that we do domestically in the United States, and that the metric for doing something is oftentimes money spent rather than the much more difficult, what do we achieve with it? Terrorism, television cameras don't lie, but they don't give the full perspective. So walking around Iraq, people will think that it's filled with terrorism, when in a country now of 35 million people, according to UN statistics, up until the recent political violence, 30 people were killed in acts of terrorism per month, less than 1 in a million. When I delve down, and whereas corruption is corrosive and impacts everyone. Now, when I delve down into the region in Iraq, I did a chapter for the Routledge Handbook of the Kurds on corruption in Kurdistan. And one of the things I found is we can all have a sense, and sitting around with people my age or students in Iraq or Iraqi Kurdistan, we can all sort of have a similar sense of what corruption is. But the legal definition of corruption in Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan was written either under the British in the 1920s or under the Iraqi Republic in the 1960s, and is completely in dissonance with the sort of conflicts of interest which would define corruption today. Clear embezzlement, that's about it. And so how do you upgrade the law? Because you can arrest people like Nouri al-Maliki, the former prime minister, who used his position and his son was acting as his business agent and so forth. You can arrest them for corruption, but the legal code won't support any charge. So then how do you get the parliamentarians, it's a catch-22, to change the legal code when they're all beneficiaries of the system, which is corrupt? And this is why you have the younger generation, now that most people, I said before, 40% of Iraqis were born after 2003, 65% of Iraqis were born after 1991. Which basically means most Iraqis don't have any functional memory of living under Saddam Hussein, as incredible, it makes all of us feel old. At any rate, the point of this is, whereas initially, after 2003, people would tolerate corruption because leaders would say, well, at least we're not Saddam Hussein. No one's willing to accept that as an excuse anymore. So you're actually having a come to name your Messiah moment across the Middle East right now with part of this youth bulge that's occurring.
Please.
First of all, I want to thank both of you for an outstanding presentation. I learned more in the last 1 hour about the Middle East than I had in the previous 70 years minus 1 hour. Anyway, my question is, 25 years from now, what do you think Saudi Arabia is going to look like? What do you think Turkey, with the fine president, is going to look like?
Brian's going to take Saudi Arabia. I'm going to take Turkey, but I'm going to start with Saudi Arabia. And before I do that, sorry, I would just highlight one of the debates I find interesting in Saudi Arabia is we often talk about the religion versus the king. But the regionalism debate I also find quite interesting. Maya Yamani, the daughter of Zaki Yamani, the former oil minister, was famous for the quip that the Stone Age didn't act for a lack and for a shortage of stones, wrote a fascinating book on regionalism in Saudi Arabia. Putting that aside, Turkey is a huge problem. And when you look at the demographic, I used to say that I was going to talk about demography in the Middle East and everyone's eyes would glaze over. When you look at sex in Turkey, The fact of the matter is, I don't think the trends we've seen recently are readily reversible. When you look at the conservatives versus the liberals, the recent victory of the center left in Istanbul and Ankara notwithstanding, I see Turkey as heading into a fundamental problem in that whether it's in Libya, whether it's elsewhere in Africa, they're substituting economic stability for basically political incitement. And they're trying to rally people around the flag in a way that's just going to breed aggression. I'm much more worried in the world when it comes to stability and U.S. security, not about the rise of countries, but about the fall of countries. I'm worried about the collapse of Turkey. I'm much more worried about the collapse of China. I mean, when you think about the demographic ramifications of decades of one-child policy, they're coming to a moment where they're going to have to deal with some fundamental economic realities, and it's too easy for people to want to lash out in order to cover that up. I think that's part of what we're seeing in the Islamic Republic of Iran right now, where Iran has had one of the most precipitous declines in birth rates of any modern country. The birth rate in Iran now is half of what it was in the 1980s. And because of that, on one hand, you have the security services who think it's going to be easier to keep security because there's less and less young people to watch over. On the other hand, you have the economic realities in Iran doing things in their near abroad to rally people around the flag. We're going to see the same sort of thing in Turkey and what we're seeing in Syria. By the way, can you name a single terrorist incident which has been staged from Syria or the regions invaded by Turkey? In the regions of Syria invaded by Turkey into Turkey, the Turks haven't been able to trace any of those terrorist incidents. And God knows I travel a lot in northeast Syria. It's a question I've been asking. So bad news on Turkey. Before I hand this over to Brian, there's an old Soviet joke about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The Soviet pessimist is the one who says, you know, things are so bad, chaos, poverty, environment, not having enough to eat, things couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one who says, no, 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 they can always get worse. And so in that case, a little bit of optimism on the Middle East.
While Michael was talking, I looked into my crystal ball for Saudi Arabia 2045, and I saw two scenarios, one the most optimistic and then the other, which is very dire. The most optimistic is that Saudi Arabia has a constitutional monarchy. One of its princes marries an actress in America. That prince and princess step back from their duties. And this constitutional monarchy has reformed its economy and it's moved forward. The very bleak scenario, and I raise this in a very serious way because it affects not just Saudi Arabia, but certainly Iran and other places. I worry that some of these countries, and Yemen too, may not be habitable by 2045. Saudi Arabia probably will be able to deal with the effects of climate change, which is real, because it has money and money to burn. But some of these places are getting extremely hot. The water tables in places like Yemen, in Iran, which Michael knows very well, as you've seen tonight. And this is the big picture, what's a driver of instability, which I think is a missing chapter in our book. And this is where I think we may disagree a bit. But when I see the recent drivers of violence in places like Iraq, Syria, and other places, people have written about this, but then are the knock-on effects of climate change. And I worry that countries like Saudi Arabia, they're trying to use their resources to adapt and change, but the resources that they're using continue to burn carbon into the atmosphere, and we're all doing it, right? And that's what I really worry as a father. My son will be 45. He'll be about my age by then, almost, if I did my math correctly. No, he'll be a bit younger. And that's a big problem that I think is already hitting some of these countries in the Middle East, already, I think, affecting the refugee and IDP, the displaced persons crisis. And I think we're just on the leading edge of that, is my concern. I think we're only starting to see the beginning of that crisis.
Okay, Joe, we have time only for one more. I'm going to go to the gentleman in the back, please. Sorry for the other.
For a long time that the wars over there have been religious. And they'll never be solved because it's a religious conflict. And how do you relate to that? Do you believe that that's true or not? And also, what happens if we just move out? We just vacate? What's going to happen? Is it going to be what we said what's going to happen in Vietnam, my era, when they said communism was going to take over, and 20 years later we're trading with the North? I mean, I don't understand that.
Okay. With regard to the wars, there's been any numbers of factors, and religion isn't the only one. A lot of factors are much more local in this regard. Putting that aside, with regard to your second question, here's the problem: that people can look at terrorism, for example, through really along a spectrum. On one hand, it's motivated by grievance. On the other hand, it's motivated by ideology. And for many diplomats, it's comforting to think that terrorism could be motivated by grievance, because then you can come up with some sort of formula to address the grievance and it will go away. But I think the case of Abdullah Azzam is very useful. Abdullah Azzam was a Palestinian who fled to Jordan as a result, from the West Bank as a result of the 1967 war. He ended up studying in Al-Azhar University in Cairo, where he was indoctrinated into the Muslim Brotherhood. Went back to Jordan, and he started teaching Jordanian students and trying to bring them into the Muslim Brotherhood, to the point where King Hussein of Jordan, the father of the current king, decided he had enough and kicked him out. He ended up teaching in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia in the middle of the 1970s. What's going on in the 1970s? It's the oil boom. So you had cosmetics, color TVs, Cadillacs. And what Abdullah Azzam and others taught was that this wasn't the passive manifestation of the petrodollar. Rather, this was a deliberate plot on the part of the Pentagon in order to separate Muslim children from God. Therefore, if using the terminology of the time, there's no difference between an F-14 bombing Mecca and David Hasselhoff on the airwaves. If you've been attacked by the Hoff, then it's perfectly permissible to hijack airliners and drive them into the World Trade Center. Now, most people haven't heard of Abdullah Azzam, but they know his most famous student, Osama bin Laden. The point of this is the grievance was this notion of Western culture. And if you can't negotiate away that sort of grievance in the confluence of grievance and ideology, then you get into a situation where you withdraw, but you continue to be hit. And so that in itself is one of the drivers. And this idea of a cycle of violence, which you didn't state, but I'll put out there, we didn't respond after the 1993 World Trade Center attacks. We did very briefly after the 1998 East Africa attacks. We didn't respond after the 2000 attacks in the USS Cole, and we did, of course, after 9/11, perhaps too much so. The point of this is, I would argue that simply divorcing ourselves from the region when you have this ideological battle ongoing doesn't work. The cycle of violence isn't an explanation. When it comes to the whole Sunni-Shia sectarian issue, the reason, look, you look at any guide to Islam and it says 10 to 15% of the Muslim world is Shiite, the rest is Sunni. So what's the big deal in the Middle East? The big deal, of course, is that draw a circle around the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and Iran, and it's 50-50 parity in there. And that's why everything is so extreme. The question is, as these battles are going out, if you go back to the religion aspect of it, then given that, I mean, some people will say Reformation and so forth, that we have our own parallels with regard to Protestantism and Catholicism and so forth. The difference is the amount of weaponry today.
Just quickly, and I'll close on this, because I share I think I hear the frustration in your voice, and I share this as I've lived it and have family members who've served in some of these endless wars. Your first question there's a long answer. My simple answer is something I said a bit earlier, which is I think religion is harnessed by those in power and then distorted to maintain their power and fight their battles. In my research from Iraq, at the popular level, to Egypt, to the Palestinians, everywhere, at a popular level, people understand this, but then they're beholden to these power structures that are there, and it's hard to change. when you hear these slogans like "End Endless War," and this is where I'll close on this, they are just slogans, because what I've experienced and seen is that if we withdraw, which we may be the best option in some places, or if we simply just look away, these wars actually don't end. And if I could recommend, quite often, 2 movies to watch. They're Oscar nominated this year. I know the director of one, and we've done some events. One is called The Cave, which is about a woman in a neighborhood outside of Damascus who runs a hospital trying to save lives. And she's fighting not just the conditions there, but she's fighting the patriarchy and all of these gender roles. And it's powerful. It's enormously powerful. The other one is called For Sama, and it's, again, in Syria. Watch those movies, because I think they offer a preview of coming attractions, unfortunately, to what could happen in some of these countries. And the key question is, should we care? Can we do anything about it? There are a number of questions to it. I would submit that we should at least wrestle with it, that we should watch and try to understand, because what I think we've witnessed, and I understand why, in the last 15 years especially, is a certain sense of a loss of our own humanity, of a reflection of people on the other side of the world. We can see these atrocities in these films. And it really pains me. I was at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for a Syria event about 1.5 years ago. And it really doesn't lend itself to easy policy solutions. And I mentioned my son, Ben. I had him at the Holocaust Memorial Museum 2 weeks ago during the Christmas break. He wanted to go. He's a big fan of World War history and history. And he came across this I'm not equating sort of the atrocities of the Holocaust to what we see in Syria, but I'm equating the problem of humanity and recognizing that. And I just think there's I understand why political debates, and we're exhausted and we can't do anything. But I think we need to continue to try to wrestle with the complexities of it, even if there's no easy answers or solutions, for the reasons why when we walked into, and again, the enormity of what happened 75 years ago, just horrific. And when we were walking into the Memorial Museum in Washington, my son Ben was like, "Are there any survivors from that?" I was like, "Buddy, they're getting old. I'm not certain if they're around." And there were 3 men sitting there at the table, and he was able to talk about their stories and things like this. And again, you can't equate these things, but this issue of humanity and what's going on in places like Syria and Yemen, in Iran and Iraq, we should at least, even if we get out of there, we should wrestle with the implications of how you get out. Because I was against the Iraq War. I was a proponent of the thing that became Barack Obama's plan. He actually took the template from things we wrote, and they got out by a date certain. And we could have done other things to mitigate the risks, and we didn't. And then we were back in. And it's this tug and pull. And I'll close on this in the book, is that unless we continue to wrestle with the complexities of these societies and recognize the humanity of others, and not come up with the simple pat sort of slogans and policy solutions, I think America can still, on the margins, move things in the right direction, but we're not the drivers of it. So that's how I close.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you all. We're adjourned.